Hey, good morning, and thanks everyone for joining the second day of the second Endeavor Summit, or as we've called it, the North Atlantic Endeavor Summit. My name is Adrian Garcia Araños. I'm the president of Endeavor. And for those of you that don't know what Endeavor is, we're the leading community of high-impact entrepreneurs. We've been doing this for practically 25 years. We're present in 40 markets, which is roughly 32, 33 countries. We have a community of approximately 5,000 mentors and board members, 2,200 Endeavor entrepreneurs that we selected in those 25 years that represent roughly 1,300 companies, out of which 1,100 are still active. So we're very proud of our community. Why do we do this? We do this because we believe in our entrepreneurs. We believe that apart from the obvious job creation, wealth creation, there's also what we call the multiplier effect, which is all of this that entrepreneurs generate from being investors, inspiring the next generation, founders that come out of companies that they founded, all of that. No, so for us, that's the most important part. That's the reason why we do what we do every day. 500 people wake up dedicated exclusively to Endeavor. So our team of 500 is dedicated to this. Our entrepreneurs, they dream big, they scale up, and they pay it forward. So today you'll be hearing a lot about them. And with that in mind, I want to thank board members, mentors, and again, the entrepreneurs, because you'll be seeing many of them today, and they'll be talking about the stories that they want to highlight. I also want to take advantage to thank our presenting sponsor, Aplauda Studios, a fascinating company as well. Barely founded in 2013 and already significantly grown, headquartered dually between Texas and El Salvador, but you can find them across Latin America and the US. So thanks to Aplauda Studios for being the sponsor. Yesterday you heard from entrepreneurs like Matt Bloomberg, Karina Sobieski, Michael Hamilton, and Alexander Wilkes Wilson. And today you'll be hearing from other founders and entrepreneurs. And with that in mind, I wanted to be able to introduce you to the first speaker of the day. In this case, it's my good friend, Endeavor mentor, Endeavor ally, a natural connector, which is Alejandro Cremades. Alejandro has a fascinating story because on the one side, he's a founder, but he's also very plugged into the entrepreneurial community and is also a now well-known author, as well as a contributor to well-known publications. Now, in 2011, he founded Rock the Post, which later became OneVest, which is one of the largest community of entrepreneurs with over 500,000 members registered in well over 200 countries. No? Apart from that, as I said, he's a contributor for Forbes. He has his own blog, which is fairly easy. So it's alejandrocremades.com. You can follow him there. And he recently wrote this magnificent book about selling your startup, which I hugely encourage you to read. I actually was able to use most of the book to be able to provide a cheat sheet if I had any questions to be able to ask Alejandro. But with that, Alejandro, I wanted to pass the stage on to you so that you can tell us a bit more about steps for successful talent integration and in post-acquisition.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for having me. It's without a doubt an honor, to be here with you all. It's always great to be able to share the stage with a good friend, Adrian, because we come a long way together. It's amazing, two Spaniards here in New York City, over the years, and what Endeavor has done, and also what you are doing now as well, Adrian, with your team is remarkable. So without a doubt, truly a pleasure not to be with you all and to be, part of the ecosystem of Endeavor. So what we're going to be talking about today is the steps for successful talent integration post-acquisition. Definitely on acquisitions, there's a lot of people talking about fundraising, but really acquisitions has been something that has not had that much of a light on. And what people really don't really get is that when you raise money, there is expectations, obviously money in comes expectations with money out, no? And with returns. So with that being said, on today's presentation, I always like to start with, a quote, and that is the quote from Nelson Mandela: "It always seems impossible until it's done." And, as Adrian, shared, I recently came out with this publication, with this book called selling your startup. And the main reason for that was because when I was executing with my previous company, OneBest, we did 4 transactions. So 3 were on the buy side, 1 was on the sell side. And what I always, came across was that there was not a lot, of literature, really covering this topic. So basically I said, hey, why not, putting something out there that is by a founder for other founders, no? And without a doubt, the journey on when it comes to the transactional side, when it comes to the, especially the integration side, is very difficult. But at the end of the day, if you show up and you take action, you're always going to be able to get to the finish line. So let's talk a little bit here about some of the stats that I think are really interesting. So if you take a look back, in time, especially since 2000, there has been over 790,000 transactions. And that is $57 trillion in value, which is really remarkable. But, obviously at the end of the day is, what happens after, that transaction. And that is some of the aspects that we're going to be covering today. Now, before we actually even talk about the post-acquisition and how you get into that integration, I think it's important to really understand what are, those acquisitions like, what are the different ones, and at what point of that process you can really benefit from really increasing the chances and optimizing the potential outcome for that post-transaction integration. No? So before that, let's talk about those types of deals. And those are essentially 2 types. You're going to have the strategic on one end, where you're going to have, basically a larger corporation buying a company, or perhaps, buying a team, which is also called an acqui-hire. And then on the other end, you're going to have the financial types of transactions. And really what separates one and the other is ultimately the level of revenues that the company is generating. So typically, when you go from a strategic to a financial is when you've been able to hit the $5 million revenue mark. When you hit that mark, at that point, you start to get private equity firms as well interested. And typically, when you're looking at, some of the factors that kick in, whether it's a strategic or a financial, and also when we're thinking about integration, is that 90% of acquisitions fail. And the main reason for that is ultimately what happens after that transaction and how you're being able to bring that company under your umbrella. Typically, the average, is about 100 days to integrate. And the other thing that you're going to be dealing with is that those companies that are looking at perhaps buying your business is that they are also looking at a bunch of other deals, especially if they are much bigger in size. Now, when we're thinking about the timeline, of that acquisition and where in that process you're going to have to really make sure that you're optimizing for a potential integration success down the line. Really in essence, what we're looking at is a 6 to 8 months process from start to finish. And everything is going to start with the outreach. So on the outreach, you're probably going to have like investment bankers or advisors that are going to be helping the business. At this point, there's going to be potential people coming to the table with interest. And this typically it could be triggered because you just want to run a process, or because maybe you have inbound interest that has really told the board and perhaps management that it's time to go and survey the market. But in essence, the bankers are going to go out, they're going to speak with other potential parties, perhaps they're going to leave as an anonymous, your company. And then depending on who is going to be a fit and who is not, you're going to be able to bring, some of the management to the discussions, share some of those materials, and then you're going to go essentially into that introductory meeting where you're going to have, the chit-chatting to really understand the synergies and how things really can come together. Then after that, you're going to go into phase 4 of that process. Typically here is going to be follow-up meetings back and forth between perhaps other teams, other groups. And then after that, you're going to go into the back and forth on follow-up meetings and follow-up emails, right? Where there's some Q&A. Really, at the end of the day, you're going to be pushing people towards an LOI. The LOI is what summarizes the terms of the transaction. It's just like what you would find on fundraisings, which is the term sheets. But ultimately, at the LOI stage, which is where you're going to be picking the one that you're going to go into a due diligence process which typically is going to require an exclusivity period of anywhere between 60 to 90 days. At this point where you jump into the diligence process is where you want to really do a deeper dive, where you want to take a look at the cultures, take a look at the synergies between the cultures, because ultimately when you do a transaction, when an acquisition happens, you need to look at how those cultures are going to blend together. Same values, same principles, same pillars, all of that stuff. And perhaps at this point is when you want to have HR involved. Now, after that diligence process, legal docs, are going to be put in place, they're going to be signed, and then the closing happens. Now, one thing that is very important here is that you need to involve HR very early as possible in this due diligence process, because that is going to increase, at the end of the day, the potential outcome, of getting a good integration done and making sure that you're not part of that 90% of acquisitions that fail. Now, ultimately, there was a study and a survey that actually was conducted by PwC. And on that survey, it was determined that only 10%, it essentially is going to be a successful retention after the transaction. And there's many different things that you can do as part of that, perhaps diligence process, and how you're taking a look at the organization, perhaps when you're on the buy side, because there's going to be different key elements, that you need to take into consideration. So when you're looking, for example, at the talent, you got to take a look at and also, differentiate merit versus ranks. There's going to be, in many instances, people that are going to have very high roles or high titles that maybe they got those because they were very loyal to management or whatever that was, but that doesn't really justify perhaps their qualifications and what they can bring to the table for your organization. So you want to take a look at what they're capable of, more, and track record and what milestones and things that they've achieved versus perhaps the title that they have, because titles can be a little bit tricky. And I think that at the end of the day, you want to be able to get those people, the best ones that you can, and really incentivize them as much as possible so that you keep them for the long run. Then the next thing is you want to as well identify, some of those strengths and weaknesses that those employees are going to have, and you want to be able to really understand how that is going to blend as well within your organization. The next thing that you want to do on those transactions is have an incentive program. Those incentive programs that you're going to be able to retain people in the long run, not just at the management level, that you're going to be doing, for example, with co-founders. So when you're doing a transaction, not only the management, especially the founders, they're going to be getting like the upfront, payment, the cash, all of that stuff, where people celebrate, especially the employees that have, some of those stock options that finally they are able to realize, the value and the sacrifice that they put into the business. But ultimately, whoever is acquiring you, they're going to be putting you into what it's called, I call it in a fun way, the vesting and resting. Obviously, in many cases, there's no resting because there's going to be many milestones and things that you need to achieve. But you need to also understand that there's going to be earnouts in place, whether it's for you, for the employees, and milestones that are going to be needed to be met in order for you to realize, especially if you're on the sell side, the complete value of the transaction. Now, if you're on the buy side, you want to also have a nice, and you see that as well a lot with private equity firms that are doing financial acquisitions. They want to come in and they want to make sure that there's a nice pool, and they could allocate anywhere between 10 to 20% of equity to management, but not only to the ones that they are getting, from the transaction, but then also to others that, they are going to be bringing outsiders based on some of the gaps that they're able to see. So that's going to be very important for you also if you're on the buy side to keep into consideration, because some of that risk, especially on that equity pool, you may be sharing that if you are dealing with private equity firms. Now, on the other side, when we're thinking about the impact, when it comes to, some of those acquisitions, there was a study that was conducted, and that study is actually very interesting. And this was a paper that was done by Daniel Kim. And Daniel Kim came up with a paper that is called Predictable Exodus, Startup Acquisitions and Employee Departures. And essentially what Kim did is he used basically employee-to-employer match data from the U.S. Census Bureau to build a data set of 4,000 high-tech startup acquisitions in the U.S. between 1990 and then also 2011. And basically, those acquisitions brought a collective of 350,000 startup employees that were acquired by new companies. one thing that you're going to be able to see on this graph that I thought it was very interesting is that ultimately, out of those transactions on the first year, 33% of acquired workers leave in that first 12 months. And that's compared to 12% that are going to be there for first time, year regular hires, which is unbelievable. Obviously, after that, you're going to see that the graph continues to decrease, but the big cliff or that big drop happens on that first year. So that's why the way that you're thinking about integration and the way that you're using communication is going to make all the difference so that you're able to flatten a little bit more that curve when it comes to the employees that are coming from the acquired business. No? Now, when we're thinking about as well, how we do that, you're going to be doing that by actively managing the retention. And the way that you're going to be actively managing the retention is, in essence, by following some of the following things. You need to be providing sufficient access to information. And I think that you're going to see this, especially if you're on the sales side, when you're doing the LOI. I mean, you're going to see many companies that go through an acquisition and literally management wait all the way until the end to tell everyone that the company is getting acquired. I think that that's a mistake, to be honest with you, because I find that communication is key. And you don't want your employees to feel like they were tricked out or that, something happens. Now, I get the concern of, hey, you want to be able to control as much as possible so things are not leaked to the press and stuff like that. But I think that the key people that are going to make that are going to have a real role on that, a blended umbrella after the transaction is done, you want to really keep them up to speed, especially because during diligence, they're going to play a key role. So having that sufficient information, having management, communicating properly, I think is going to be ultimately advantageous for everyone. And this needs to have a message that is aligned with everyone in management and that resonates ultimately very well with employees. The other thing that you want to do as well is you want to monitor workload. When that transaction happens, there's going to be probably people that are going to be leaving, people that, you're going to have to let go, especially if you're on the buy side, because ultimately they're not going to be justified as employees. Now, the problem that you're going to see with this is that many employees are going to end up with a bunch of workload on top of everything that they had already, and people are going to be overwhelmed. So you need to be very careful with this. The other thing is you need to have, the main people why people end up leaving an organization is because they don't see a future for themselves. They cannot see themselves living into the future of that organization. So you need to help them in developing themselves, in seeing how that future continues to transform and a future that makes them excited. And ultimately, some of the things that you want to implement and give them access to is ongoing learning and professional development, which I think is going to be a critical factor here. Then the other thing that you want to do as well is you want to meet regularly with employees. You want to meet regularly with them. You want to have one-on-one meetings. You want to have those catch-ups and discuss, how they're coping with the new roles. How are they coping, with the additional workload that they have to, take on as a result of this transaction. You want to have that nice streamlined level of communication between the parties. Then the other thing that you want to do is you want to have tangible performance. You want to have objectives. You want to incentivize around those objectives. And obviously, when you're doing the deal, there's going to be different things that are going to be giving them, like an excitement around those incentives. It could be, around the earnouts that everyone is getting. It could be around the back end part of the transaction, because in many instances, you're going to see how those transactions, they're going to be broken down on whatever you're getting on the front end, like literally upon closing. And then the other part that you're going to be getting on the back end, like over time, over perhaps 2 to 3 years course of time. So maybe, on that bucket is where you really get the critical people, get them incentivized and get them aligned towards those goals as well so that they stay for the long run. Then the other thing that you want to do is you want to provide sufficient managerial support. You want to be there with them. I think that the managers are ultimately playing a role model too. You want to also perhaps, show people that they can grow within the organization. Maybe, there's going to be, as we were looking, back on what I was mentioning, merit versus rank, maybe there's going to be people that have that merit, that makes sense to really, promote them. And I think that that's going to send also a positive signal to everyone else, because they're going to see how in this new organization, there is a future for themselves. Then the other thing that you want to do is you want to have surveys, between employees so that you can monitor, how people feel, what's, the energy, like, and all of that kind of stuff is ultimately going to have a significant impact. And, I'd like to, really finish it off, here with this phrase from Peter Drucker. And, he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I couldn't agree more. Ultimately, when you're going through a transaction, there's going to be different cultures, coming together. There's going to be different egos that you're going to have to manage. But ultimately, you also need to know that, especially if you are on the buy side and you're acquiring a startup, many of the employees that were on that startup joined the startup because they had the entrepreneurial drive. Many of them took the sacrifice, or placed the bet and said, hey, you know what? Now I'm going to earn maybe less salary, but I'm going to have more potential upside. And I'm going to be more excited because, I get to wear different hats, or it's more like intrapreneurial, where you're like having that entrepreneurial drive, even though, you're not the founder, but you want to perhaps, really have a good understanding of what moves people, what drives people. And make sure that ultimately that culture that ends up being the blend between all these different, companies coming together, it's unified and it has that level of unity. So with that being said, it's really what I had, for today's session. I think that ultimately the integration, it doesn't happen post-transaction. It happens pre-transaction, just as I share with you all. You want to make sure that on the diligence part, you have that level of communication, transparency. You also want to set up expectations, because in many instances too, when you go through one of those transactions, people tend to overpromise and underdeliver, and that is a big, big problem, a big no-no. So ultimately, you want to make sure that everyone understands the expectations, everyone is aligned on those expectations, and everyone is rowing in the same direction with the same speed. So thank you, everyone.
Alejandro, thanks so much. I have many questions that come up through having heard your conversation now, but also going through the book, and plus the kind of questions that you and I had discussed prior to the meeting. But there's one thing that I wanted to emphasize on, because I know that in your book you have, and I'm going to go to the book and then I'll go to the questions. But there are two questions in particular. One is chapter 3 of your book. You speak about the role of investment bankers, no? And this is a typical mistake that we've seen, that an entrepreneur tends to know really well their area and their sector, and they feel that they can do it on their own, and they don't feel that they need to bring in the professionals, no? And it's the one common mistake that I've always seen. And whenever acquisitions do happen, the ones that have done it with investment bankers say the amount that they've learned and what they've been able to obtain, and the ones that haven't say, what a mistake. If I'd done it again, I would have done it. Can you speak a bit more about that role? Why? And one of the points that you mentioned is why bankers add value, no?
Yeah, I mean, I love that question, Adrian, because ultimately, I find that you need to have the good cop, bad cop. So when it comes to management and also to founders, they always need to be on the good side. They always want to talk about vision, about projects, about working together. And I think that when it comes to the deal terms of the transaction, you need to, as the management team or as the company or operators, you need to remove yourself from that type of conversation. You need to have other people that are going to be going in, guns blazing, really negotiating, those terms, that valuation, to really increase it as much as possible. But ultimately, as the company, you want to definitely remove yourself. In many instances, you're going to see how many of those deals get tangled up, whether it is on the negotiation process or whether it is when the lawyers are coming in and they're drafting up and negotiating like stupid language. Because ultimately, as a recovering lawyer, I can tell you that when the deal closes, the lawyer, doesn't get to bill anymore. Right. So I think that they're a little bit more incentivized to complicate a little bit more the language. So I find that in many instances, by having external people advising and helping, it's going to be helpful so that you as the founder or you as the CEO can pick up the phone and untangle whatever needs to be untangled by grabbing the phone, calling the other CEO, and just making sure that things can continue to move forward and always being on the positive side, always talking about vision, talking about excitement. That's where you want it to be. You don't want to be caught up in the negotiation process.
Perfect. And then another thing that you also touched upon in your book towards the end, is the whole thing about the emotional roller coaster. You speak about anxiety, depression, acceptance, and happiness. And I feel that that's the case both during the acquisition itself and post-acquisition too. I mean, there's also a moment of joy when you've already closed, but there's also another moment of, and now what do I do? But there's I think that those emotional roller coasters happen during and post. But in your experience and having spoken with as many, and I know that in both your blog and the piece that you write for Forbes, you've spoken with so many founders. I mean, I have no idea how many founders you speak with per year, but if it's not in the hundreds, it's definitely in the several dozens. But what have you learned about this whole emotional roller coaster? I mean, what else can you share with us?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, Adrian, because one of the things that I've seen, that not only I experienced personally, during the transaction that we did, for us, but then as a result of speaking with so many founders on the Deal Makers podcast, which is basically where I interview super successful entrepreneurs and they share their transactional side, how they sold their companies or raise money. When it comes to really going through the transaction, you feel, this is your baby, this is your company. In many instances, you see how founders make the mistake of thinking that they are the business. And that's not really the case, because at the end of the day, every company is going to die. Every company is going to die, whether it is because they get acquired, because they get merged into another entity, because they go bankrupt, because they shut it down. But every brand is not going to be here forever, right? Unlimited time. They're going to have their time. And I think that founders need to always, start with the end. And that's why, this book that I wrote, I thought it was very interesting, because it doesn't matter if you want to go through an acquisition or not. If you're thinking of starting a company or you're in the process of building, you need to have that end in mind. And one of the things that is true is that, when you've been for so long building and scaling a company, it truly feels like when you do that transaction and you ink the deal, you sign that asset purchase agreement, it feels like you had a family member dying. That's really the way it feels, because that's everything that you were used to do. And all of a sudden, you ink the deal, and then the next day you go back to the office and you're reporting to someone else. So everything is out there. Everything is changed. And that is unfortunately a big roller coaster. Obviously at the beginning is the uncertainty. Then you go into the excitement of inking the deal. And maybe, you're at the management level and you own some stock. And then you're thinking about what you're going to buy, the mortgage you're going to pay down and all of that stuff. But then all of a sudden, we are human beings. It's all about making an impact and making a difference. And I find that founders need to know that after this, as they say, once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur. There's going to be something that is going to come after. Don't put yourself down. Don't get depressed because it's not what it used to be, because that's just the cycle. That's the way it goes. And you are not your company. You are not your company. And I think that you need to detach the identity from the business. And I think that also that's going to help you when you're getting the deal done, because the best deals get done when you're able to be fully unattached to the outcome. When you're so attached, when you are the business, when you want to succeed, when you want this bad, then that's when you're going to be signaling desperation to that potential buyer. But when you are completely unattached to the outcome and you know what you want, and hey, if they give it to you, great, whether it's in price or whether it's in culture, and if not, you're willing to walk away, that's when you get the best deals done, actually.
So it's about being a good poker player, basically, no?
Literally.
Not show your cards and not use any facial expressions, no? So
that's it. You go with the sunglasses to the negotiation.
You spoke about the impact that the founder is going to have and the organization will have, and you also spoke about the next chapter of the entrepreneur once they get acquired. As you know, one of the values that we always speak about dream big, scale up, and pay it forward. So the pay it forward part is the give back part is a core part to the story that we're always trying to say, at Endeavor. How do you think about the value of M&A should create? We're always thinking about the value it creates for founders and C-suite, but also for the entire organization down to the junior staff. You write about vesting and resting periods. So I'd like to more about the impact that has on founders, especially if they continue to have a role in the new entity.
Yeah, I think that it's all about seeing a future for yourself. And I think that there's two parts to that. I mean, one is at the time when you're closing the deal, making sure that you can see yourself continuing, leaving a legacy, because otherwise, it's interesting because that vesting and resting, you're going to have to be there for 2 to 3 years. So why not just having 2 to 3 years where you're having a great time and you're being able to surround yourself by great people, and where you get to enjoy going to the workplace versus feeling like you have a bunch of handcuffs and that you're completely miserable, when you wake up and you do the 9 to 5, because that's the way it's going to feel like. Now, I think that part of this is really taking a look at who you're looking to blend, your culture with. I mean, in many instances, one of the things that I've seen from repeated founders that you see, that I've interviewed on Deal Makers on the podcast, is people that, have built a $1 billion business. They do an exit, and then all of a sudden they build another $1 billion business. But funny enough, they build it with the people that they met on the organization that they were brought in once they were acquired. You want to be surrounded by people that you can learn, from, and going back again to what I was alluding to, where you see a future for yourself. And I think that when you're getting the deal done, whether it's looking, after yourself and your co-founder or looking after your employees, you need to create an environment where people are excited to come to work. And I think that really taking a look on the diligence side, when you're looking at doing the deal or not, as much diligence they're doing on you when you are the seller, you need to do a lot of diligence as well on the buyer and really understand, what motivates them, what drives them, and just make sure that aligns as well with what you guys have going on.
So we've always focused now on the acquisition and the success of the acquisition, the integration, what happens post. But what about the acquisition failing? I mean, this can happen prior to all the process and during the process. How do you continue to push through vision as leader after acquisition has failed? But more importantly, how do you retain the talent after a failed acquisition?
Yeah, I think that's why communication is key. I've seen in many instances where you see how perhaps management waited too long and they completely failed on the communication process with employees. And then all of a sudden, it gets leaked to the press or something like that there was a deal in the works and then it blew up. And then everyone is getting pissed because either they thought that it was that they were going to get equity and they never got equity, or, I think that communication is absolutely everything. So when you make communication a critical component of anything, in an organization, especially when you're going through a deal, it's going to be making it or breaking it, in the event the transaction doesn't go forward. I find too that being unattached to the outcome and really being focused on building something with true value, I find that's really the essence, because ultimately, if it's not acquirer A, it's going to be acquirer B, and there's always going to be people that are going to be interested. So I think that you always need to the risk, as the operator, as the founder, and part of the risking is really ensuring that you're always preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And part of that is definitely, keeping it very, very, very thin line and very streamlined when it comes to the communication with everyone in the organization.
So it's fascinating. I mean, the book is full of nuggets, and you have a ton of experience having been one entrepreneur and dealing so much with entrepreneurs. But apart from the advice that you're providing, what about advice that's been given to you? What is the best piece of advice that you've ever received, or what are the best pieces of advice that you have ever received?
To be honest with you, there's a question that I asked always on the podcast. And that question is, if you could go into a time machine and go back in time and ask your younger self, or tell your younger self one piece of advice before launching a business, before launching the business that you actually started, what would that be and why, based on what you know now? And it's interesting because based on all the conversations that I've had, also on looking back as well at my own journey, I always come up with the same thing. And that is, I should have listened more. And I find that listening is the key to everything. And it's not listening for looking good. It's not listening for giving the right answer. It's a special kind of listening. And that is the listening for identifying the concerns that are in between you and getting things done, whether that is getting an acquisition done, whether that is raising a round of financing, whether that is getting your employees excited about the future that they're living into, whatever that is, it's always concerns in between you and whatever needs to happen. And unfortunately, as entrepreneurs, it's very easy to get in your own head, to really try to figure things out in your own head. And nothing, gets resolved and done in your head. Everything happens in the conversation. And there's a great example, when it comes to listening. And that is the example, that you can find on, I love this book. It's called The Ride of a Lifetime. And it was authored by Bob Iger, who was the CEO of Walt Disney. And on that book, on that chapter, he talks about that time where they received a lawsuit. And it was the lawsuit by one of the grandchildren of Walt Disney, the founder. And on that lawsuit, he was alleging that Bob Iger was fraudulently appointed as the CEO of the business. So what Bob Iger did, instead of like throwing more fuel to the fire and making this, being like the best, piece of information for the gossip media outlets that love this kind of stuff, he called the guy directly. And basically out of what he did, instead of sending his litigation team, he called him directly. He took him for lunch. And out of being at lunch, being in the conversation, listening, what he got was that the main driver that pushed this individual to bring that lawsuit was not the fact that Bob Iger was fraudulently appointed by the board of directors. The main driver was that this guy was never up to the expectations of his own family. And when he was present to that Bob Iger, what he did is he gave him an emeritus role to the board. He also, which is no voice, no influence, no nothing. He also gave him premier access to all the events of Disney. And as a result of that, which involved nothing, just listening, this guy ended up dropping the lawsuit. And that is what listening for identifying concerns looks like, and the way that CEOs and founders and anyone in an organization should implement so that they can really be efficient and effective with whatever they have in front of them.
So speaking of listening, and given that we have 5 minutes left, let's listen to our audience. I don't know if there's questions, but we did want to open up for questions from the audience. So I don't know if the team has received any questions. If not, we can keep on going. I do have a few things that I've noted down, but I wanted to open.
And also, if people prefer as well, they can send me an email too directly. If there's anyone that is shy in the audience, they can reach out directly as well. That's not a problem.
So look, Alejandro, I'm getting some questions here from the team as well. One of them is, what do you think it attributes to the low retention rate during the first year? So you were showing that graph of that low retention on year one, a huge drop on year one. What is the cause now?
Without a doubt, communication. I think that communication is a big one. Out of that study, something that was really interesting was that the companies that had patents were the ones that end up retaining the most amount of employees. But I find that communication is a critical one, especially when you're thinking about startup acquisitions, because ultimately those people, those employees that joined that startup, they joined and did so because they had the entrepreneurial drive too. I mean, they joined maybe at a Series A, they joined at a Series B, where the company was still figuring out maybe like ramping up, figuring out growth, figuring out product market fit, launching new stuff. And now perhaps, what may be there for them is that they are acquired by this larger organization and they feel like some of that innovation, some of that drive, some of that adrenaline, is going to be gone. And I find that whoever is acquiring, on the buy side, they need to make sure that they're communicating, that they are sharing what that vision is going to look like in a very crisp and clear way, so that they can keep that excitement going. And again, I think that it all comes down to the same thing. It all comes down to people being able to see and live into a future for themselves that really gets them excited. And that is why managers, why the company that is buying need to make that a key priority in that integration process, which starts, by the way, at the due diligence by involving HR early on. Perfect.
So Alejandro, you and I have known each other for a while. You've been in this journey of entrepreneurship and in the ecosystem for over a decade. I am a bit younger on that side. I've only been exposed to this directly for the last 7 to 8 years, no? But you and I met a lot of successful entrepreneurs. We by complete chance, we used to hang out a lot with Spaniards in New York. All of them were corporate Spaniards, by the way, and many of them decided to become entrepreneurs at some point. Some of them have uber successful, and they're now leading unicorn companies or listed companies. So it's been fun journey to actually see this from so close. People that we used to just socialize with, to see them become entrepreneurs, successful, and these huge role models in countries all over the world. But at the same time, I'm always curious to know. I mean, you and I have both been exposed to this directly through this by complete chance, but then we also both found a way in which we're now dedicated to this. And you speak with so many. I mean, between your podcast, the blog, the ones that you write about, now authoring this book. I always have this question, but what are the common traits that you've seen on a successful entrepreneur? What would you say are the things that stand out? What is the first thing that you're looking into when you're speaking with entrepreneurs, especially having been well over a decade speaking with entrepreneurs?
I think that without a doubt, number one, people that are in it for the problem. People that are in it for the problem, that really is going to create, that drive, that passion is going to move them, is going to push them through the tough days, especially when they are at a seed to Series A, when you feel like your company is going to break and is going to go down the toilet at any point. You need to make sure that drive and that passion, when you get that 10% of days that are great, they keep you moving, towards that next cycle, that is going to open up and to create more certainty and things like that. I think that being in it for the problem is a big one. When you see people that are in it for the money or for other reasons, that company is not going to stick for a long time. I think that the other one is just being a cockroach. Nothing is going to kill you, right? There's going to be many instances where you're going to be falling out of the horse, and it's all about getting back up. Because I like, this quote from the founder of Dropbox, that he says that ultimately you only need to be right once, and when you really hit it, and you hit that nerve in the market, that's when, things can really blow up in a really positive way. So I think that having enough times to really to get to the bat and swing is without a doubt, what is going to optimize is the chances there. And then the third thing that I always see from these founders that have achieved, great amount of success is always really thinking how to continue to surround themselves by the right people. Because as the saying goes, you can go faster when you go at it alone, but you go much farther when you go together. So it's all about building those relationships over time, but also not thinking, hey, now it's time to I need to recruit this person, or I need to put a bunch of ads on LinkedIn and stuff like that. No, I mean, it's about knowing who you need to call when you need to make that phone call. So having already that network. So you're going to see many of those founders that they're able to really see far, ahead of themselves, what kind of organization they want to build. And that goes to what I was pointing to before, is start with the end, right? Start thinking about what the end is going to look like and reverse back engineer the process to where you are today in order to get there. But really being able to know who to call when you need to call them, and really bring them, as part of the team. Again, it's all about team, it's all about team effort and culture. And without that, there is absolutely nothing. So those are some of the key traits and things that I tend to see on these founders that end up achieving success.
So Alejandro, look, thank you so much. Thanks so much for doing this. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for accepting the invitation. I want to do one last plug to your book of selling your startup. So for all the audience, here's the book. Please take a screenshot and go to your nearest bookstore, Amazon, or whatever other website you use to buy it. I was having lunch with also a well-known author earlier this week, and he was telling me about the challenges of being able to launch a book through the pandemic. So it's not your typical launch. So to that sense, I want to do a triple plug on this one, because it's uncertain times not to launch a book, but we have maybe some more time to actually be able to afford to read. So this was definitely a good read. For me, it was super interesting. Alejandro, again, thank you so much for doing this. And with that, I think that we're exactly on time and we can pass it on to the next.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It's been an honor.